The sound of helicopter blades cut through the desert air as the medical evacuation team prepared for another routine mission. Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet and checked her medical kit one final time. She had been working as a combat medic in Afghanistan for 8 months now, and each day brought new challenges that tested both her medical skills and emotional strength. The call came in just after dawn. A Navy SEAL team had encountered heavy enemy fire during a reconnaissance mission near the Pakistani border. 2 soldiers were critically wounded and needed immediate medical attention. Sarah's team was the closest medical unit available, and time was running out. As their helicopter approached the landing zone, Sarah could see the SEAL team positioned in a defensive formation around their wounded comrades. The team looked exhausted and battle-worn, their faces covered in dust and sweat. She had worked with special forces before, but there was something different about this particular group. They moved with a precision and intensity that spoke of countless hours of training and real combat experience. The helicopter touched down, and Sarah immediately jumped out with her medical bag. The first wounded soldier had taken shrapnel to his leg and was conscious but in severe pain. She quickly assessed his condition and began applying pressure bandages to stop the bleeding. The second soldier was unconscious with a head injury that required immediate attention. While Sarah worked on stabilizing the patients, she noticed the other SEAL team members watching her closely. Their eyes followed her every movement as she administered pain medication and prepared the wounded for transport. She was used to being observed during medical emergencies, but this felt different somehow. There was a respect in their gaze that she rarely saw from combat units. The team leader, a weathered sergeant with graying temples, approached her as she finished securing the second patient for helicopter transport. He introduced himself as Sergeant Mike Rodriguez and thanked her for the quick response. Sarah nodded professionally and began loading the wounded soldiers into the aircraft. As they lifted off, Sarah continued monitoring her patient's vital signs while the helicopter flew toward the military hospital. The unconscious soldier's condition was stabilizing, but she remained concerned about potential brain swelling. The other wounded SEAL was alert and trying to make conversation despite his pain, asking about her background and how long she had been deployed. During the flight, Sarah noticed Sergeant Rodriguez staring at her name tape on her uniform. His expression changed from casual interest to something much more serious. He leaned forward and asked if she was the same S. Mitchell who had served in Iraq 3 years earlier. Sarah confirmed her previous deployment but didn't elaborate on the details. The sergeant's face grew pale, and he immediately called the other team members over. They huddled together, speaking in hushed tones while occasionally glancing in her direction. Sarah focused on her patients, but she could sense the shift in atmosphere inside the helicopter. Something about her identity had clearly affected these hardened warriors in a way she didn't understand. When they arrived at the hospital, Sarah helped transfer the patients to the emergency medical team. Both wounded soldiers were stable and expected to make full recoveries. As she prepared to leave, Sergeant Rodriguez approached her again, this time with his entire team standing behind him. He looked directly into her eyes and said something that would stay with her forever. He told her that they knew who she was and what she had done in Iraq. The whole team had heard the stories, but they never imagined they would actually meet the medic who had become a legend among Special Forces units. Sarah felt her chest tighten as memories she had tried to bury came rushing back. The incident in Iraq was something she rarely talked about, and she had hoped to leave it in the past. But now, facing these elite soldiers who looked at her with a mixture of awe and respect, she realized that some stories follow you no matter how far you try to run from them. The sergeant explained that word of her actions had spread throughout the special operations community. Every SEAL, Ranger, and Delta Force operator knew about the medic who had done something extraordinary under impossible circumstances. They had all hoped to serve alongside her someday, and now that opportunity had finally come. Sarah remained silent, unsure how to respond to their praise. The weight of their expectations felt heavier than any medical equipment she had ever carried. She had joined the military to save lives and serve her country, not to become some kind of hero figure in the eyes of elite warriors. As she walked away from the hospital, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her past was about to catch up with her in ways she never anticipated. The look in those SEALs' eyes told her that they expected something from her that she wasn't sure she could deliver again. The silence she had maintained about Iraq was about to be broken, whether she wanted it or not. 3 years earlier in Iraq, Sarah had been a different person. Fresh out of medical school and eager to serve, she had volunteered for combat deployment despite having safer options available. Her family had tried to talk her out of it, but Sarah felt called to help soldiers on the front lines where medical expertise was needed most. Her assignment took her to Forward Operating Base Phoenix, located in one of the most dangerous regions of Iraq. The base was constantly under threat from insurgent attacks, and medical emergencies were a daily occurrence. Sarah quickly earned the respect of the soldiers by working long hours and never refusing a call for help, no matter how dangerous the situation. The base was home to a mixed unit of Army infantry, Marines, and a small special operations team that conducted night raids on high-value targets. Sarah treated everyone equally, from the youngest private to the most experienced Special Forces operator. She never asked questions about their missions and focused solely on keeping them healthy and combat-ready. Everything changed on October 15th, during what started as a routine patrol mission. A convoy of 3 vehicles was returning from a village reconnaissance when they hit a sophisticated roadside bomb, followed immediately by coordinated small arms fire from multiple positions. The attack was clearly planned and executed by experienced fighters who knew how to maximize casualties. The explosion destroyed the lead vehicle completely and severely damaged the second truck. Radio communications were partially down, and the surviving soldiers found themselves pinned down in a deadly crossfire with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. The third vehicle had been far enough back to avoid the initial blast, but its crew was trapped behind their disabled trucks with wounded comrades bleeding out in the kill zone. Sarah was at the base when the distress call came through the radio. The convoy commander's voice was strained as he reported multiple casualties and requested immediate medical evacuation. However, the helicopter crews were already engaged in another emergency mission, and the quick reaction force was still 30 minutes away from reaching the ambush site. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her medical bag and ran toward the motor pool where a single armored vehicle remained. The driver was a young corporal named Danny, who had never been in combat before. But he didn't hesitate when Sarah asked him to take her to the ambush site. They both knew it was against protocol for medical personnel to enter an active firefight, but soldiers were dying while they spoke. The 10-mile drive to the ambush site felt like an eternity as they listened to increasingly desperate radio transmissions from the trapped convoy. Enemy fire was intensifying and the soldiers were running low on ammunition. 2 men were already unconscious from blood loss, and a third was showing signs of shock from a severe abdominal wound. When they arrived at the scene, Sarah could immediately assess the tactical situation. The convoy was trapped in a valley with enemy fighters positioned on both sides of the road. The soldiers had taken cover behind their damaged vehicles, but they were completely exposed to enemy fire whenever they tried to move. The wounded men were lying in the most dangerous part of the kill zone, where any rescue attempt would draw concentrated enemy fire. Sarah studied the terrain and realized that the only way to reach the wounded soldiers was to cross approximately 50 meters of open ground under direct enemy observation. The insurgents had positioned themselves specifically to prevent any rescue attempts, and they were using the wounded Americans as bait to draw more soldiers into their trap. The convoy commander, Staff Sergeant Williams, crawled over to Sarah's position and explained the situation in detail. 3 of his men were critically wounded and would die without immediate medical attention. However, every attempt to reach them had been met with intense enemy fire that had already wounded 2 more soldiers. The enemy fighters seemed to have unlimited ammunition and were clearly prepared for a prolonged engagement. Sarah listened to the tactical assessment while watching the wounded soldiers through her binoculars. She could see that time was running out for all 3 men. The soldier with the abdominal wound was losing consciousness, and the other 2 were showing signs of severe blood loss. If she didn't act within the next few minutes, they would all die regardless of whether the quick reaction force eventually arrived. The staff sergeant looked at Sarah with desperate eyes and asked if there was anything she could do from their current position. He knew that sending more soldiers into the kill zone would only result in additional casualties, but he couldn't bear the thought of watching his men die without trying everything possible to save them. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. She told Staff Sergeant Williams that she was going to cross the open ground and treat the wounded soldiers where they lay. She would need covering fire from his remaining men, but she believed she could stabilize the patients long enough for evacuation once the quick reaction force arrived. The staff sergeant stared at her in disbelief and immediately refused to allow such a dangerous mission. He pointed out that she would be completely exposed to enemy fire for several minutes while treating the wounded, and the insurgents would certainly concentrate their fire on her position. It would be suicide, and he wouldn't be responsible for losing their only medic in a hopeless rescue attempt. Sarah looked Staff Sergeant Williams directly in the eyes and spoke with a calm confidence that surprised even herself. She explained that she had taken an oath to preserve life, and that she couldn't stand by while soldiers died when she had the medical skills to save them. She understood the risks, but she also knew that doing nothing would guarantee the death of 3 good men who had families waiting for them at home. The staff sergeant tried to argue, but Sarah was already checking her medical supplies and preparing for the crossing. She organized her equipment for maximum efficiency, knowing that every second in the open would increase her chances of being hit by enemy fire. She also gave detailed instructions to Corporal Danny about how to provide emergency medical support if she was wounded during the rescue attempt. The other soldiers in the convoy had overheard the conversation, and they gathered around Sarah to express their concerns. These were experienced combat veterans who understood battlefield tactics, and they all agreed that crossing the kill zone was essentially a suicide mission. The enemy fighters had clear fields of fire and had already demonstrated their accuracy by hitting multiple targets. Despite their protests, Sarah could see in their eyes that they respected her decision. They had all been in situations where someone had to take extreme risks to save their comrades, and they understood the moral weight of the choice she was making. They also knew that without her intervention, they would have to watch their friends die slowly while being unable to help. Staff Sergeant Williams finally agreed to support her mission after Sarah made it clear that she was going regardless of his approval. He quickly organized his remaining soldiers to provide covering fire and establish communication protocols for the rescue attempt. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would lay down suppressive fire while Sarah crossed the open ground, then maintain fire superiority while she treated the wounded. The soldiers checked their weapons and ammunition counts before taking positions to provide the best possible covering fire. They had limited rounds remaining, so every shot would have to count. The plan required perfect timing and coordination, with no room for error or hesitation. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared herself mentally for what was about to happen. She had trained for combat medical situations, but nothing could truly prepare someone for running into direct enemy fire to treat wounded soldiers. She focused on the medical procedures she would need to perform and tried to block out thoughts about her own safety. At exactly 13:47 hours, Staff Sergeant Williams gave the signal to begin the mission. The American soldiers opened fire on the enemy positions, sending a wall of bullets toward the insurgent fighters. The enemy immediately responded with their own intense fire, creating a deafening noise that echoed through the valley. Sarah sprinted from cover and began crossing the open ground toward the wounded soldiers. Enemy bullets whistled past her head and kicked up dust around her feet as she ran in a zigzag pattern to make herself a harder target. The 50-meter distance felt like miles as she focused on reaching the first wounded soldier. Halfway across the kill zone, Sarah felt a bullet tear through her left sleeve, barely missing her arm. She stumbled but kept running, knowing that stopping would mean certain death. The covering fire from her fellow soldiers was keeping most of the enemy fighters suppressed, but several were still able to shoot at her exposed position. She reached the first wounded soldier, Private Johnson, who had taken shrapnel to his chest and was barely conscious. Sarah immediately began assessing his injuries while staying as low as possible to minimize her exposure to enemy fire. The wounds were severe but treatable if she could stop the bleeding and maintain his airway. Working under fire was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in training. The constant noise of gunfire made it difficult to concentrate, and the knowledge that enemy fighters were actively trying to kill her added a layer of stress that she had never imagined. However, her medical training took over, and she found herself working with surprising efficiency despite the circumstances. After stabilizing Private Johnson's breathing and applying pressure bandages to his chest wounds, Sarah crawled 15 meters to reach Sergeant Martinez, who had suffered a severe abdominal injury. His condition was critical, and she could see that he was going into shock from blood loss. This would be the most challenging medical procedure of her career, and she would have to perform it while lying flat on the ground under enemy fire. The enemy fighters had adjusted their tactics and were now concentrating their fire on Sarah's position. Bullets were hitting the ground within inches of where she worked, and she could hear fragments of rock and metal whistling past her head. The American covering fire was becoming less effective as their ammunition ran low, and the enemy was becoming more aggressive in their targeting. Sarah forced herself to ignore the incoming fire and focus completely on treating Sergeant Martinez's wounds. She worked quickly but carefully, knowing that any mistake could cost him his life. The abdominal injury required immediate surgery that she couldn't provide in the field, but she could stabilize him long enough for evacuation to a proper medical facility. While working on the sergeant, Sarah became aware that the gunfire around her position was decreasing. She looked up to see several enemy fighters moving to new positions that would give them better angles to shoot at her location. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she realized that she might not be able to reach the third wounded soldier before the enemy overran their position. The third wounded soldier, Corporal Thompson, was lying 20 meters away from Sarah's current position. He had taken a direct hit from an enemy rifle and was unconscious with severe bleeding from a head wound. Sarah could see that his condition was deteriorating rapidly, and she estimated that he had less than 10 minutes before blood loss would make any medical intervention useless. The enemy fighters had repositioned themselves and were now able to maintain constant fire on the area where the wounded soldiers lay. Sarah realized that attempting to reach Corporal Thompson would expose her to crossfire from multiple directions, making survival extremely unlikely. However, leaving him to die was not an option she could accept. Staff Sergeant Williams could see the impossible situation Sarah faced, and he radioed to inform her that the quick reaction force was still 15 minutes away. He strongly advised her to stay in her current position and wait for additional support, pointing out that she had already saved 2 lives and shouldn't risk throwing away her own life in a hopeless attempt to reach the third soldier. Sarah looked at Sergeant Martinez, whom she had just stabilized, and then toward Corporal Thompson's motionless form. She could see blood pooling around his head, and she knew that waiting 15 minutes would guarantee his death. The medical calculations were simple. He needed immediate intervention or he would die regardless of what happened afterward. Making the most difficult decision of her military career, Sarah told Staff Sergeant Williams that she was going to attempt to reach Corporal Thompson. She quickly organized her remaining medical supplies and prepared for what she knew would be the most dangerous 20 meters of her life. The enemy fighters were now specifically watching for any movement from her position. Before beginning her final sprint, Sarah took a moment to call Corporal Danny on the radio. She gave him detailed instructions about continuing medical care for the 2 soldiers she had already treated, including specific medication dosages and procedures to follow if their conditions changed. She spoke calmly and professionally, as if she were simply handing off a routine patient to another medical provider. The covering fire from the American soldiers had become sporadic due to their low ammunition levels, but they continued to engage the enemy positions as effectively as possible. Sarah could hear Staff Sergeant Williams coordinating their remaining resources to provide maximum support for her final rescue attempt. At 14:02 hours, Sarah broke cover and began sprinting toward Corporal Thompson's position. The enemy response was immediate and overwhelming, with multiple fighters concentrating their fire on her exposed figure. Bullets struck the ground all around her as she ran in an erratic pattern, using every piece of cover available in the barren landscape. 10 meters into her sprint, Sarah felt a sharp pain in her right shoulder as a bullet grazed her body armor. The impact spun her around, but she maintained her balance and continued running toward the wounded soldier. She could feel blood beginning to soak through her uniform, but the wound didn't seem to be life-threatening. She reached Corporal Thompson and immediately began assessing his head injury while lying flat beside him. The wound was more severe than she had initially observed, with significant bleeding and signs of possible brain trauma. This would require the most advanced medical procedures in her skill set, and she would have to perform them while under the most intense enemy fire of the entire engagement. Working with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline, Sarah began the delicate process of treating a serious head wound under combat conditions. She had to control bleeding while ensuring that she didn't cause additional brain damage through improper handling. The procedure required steady hands and complete concentration, both of which were nearly impossible to maintain under heavy enemy fire. Halfway through treating Corporal Thompson, Sarah noticed that the enemy fire had suddenly decreased significantly. She looked up to see American helicopters approaching from the east, with the distinctive sound of rotor blades that meant the quick reaction force had finally arrived. The enemy fighters were beginning to withdraw from their positions to avoid the incoming air support. The arrival of helicopters changed the entire tactical situation within minutes. The enemy fighters, who had been confident in their ability to overwhelm the trapped convoy, now found themselves exposed to air attack and began a hasty retreat. The immediate threat to Sarah and the wounded soldiers was over, but her medical work was far from finished. With the pressure of enemy fire reduced, Sarah was able to complete her treatment of Corporal Thompson's head wound and stabilize his condition for evacuation. All 3 wounded soldiers were now stable enough for transport to a proper medical facility, though their conditions remained serious and would require immediate surgery upon arrival. The quick reaction, 4 soldiers who arrived at the scene were amazed to find that a single medic had crossed an active kill zone 3 times to treat wounded soldiers under direct enemy fire. They had expected to find multiple casualties and were instead met with a scene where all the wounded had received professional medical care despite the ongoing combat. Situation Staff Sergeant Williams briefed the incoming commander about Sarah's actions during the engagement, explaining how she had single-handedly prevented what would have been 3 combat deaths. The other soldiers in the convoy supported his account, describing her calm professionalism and medical expertise under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. As medical evacuation helicopters arrived to transport the wounded soldiers, Sarah finally allowed herself to receive treatment for her own injuries. The bullet graze on her shoulder was painful but not serious, and she had suffered several minor cuts from rock fragments thrown up by enemy bullets. However, she refused to be evacuated and insisted on continuing her duties at the base. The story of Sarah's actions during the ambush spread throughout the military community with remarkable speed. Within days, soldiers from other bases were talking about the medic who had crossed a kill zone 3 times to save wounded comrades. The tale grew with each telling, but the core facts remained the same. A single medical officer had prevented 3 combat deaths through extraordinary courage and skill. Military leadership took notice of the incident immediately. Sarah was summoned to meet with senior officers who wanted to understand exactly what had happened during the engagement. She provided a detailed, factual account of her actions while downplaying the personal risks she had taken. Her modest description of the events only increased the respect that others felt for her accomplishment. The 3 soldiers Sarah had saved all made full recoveries, though their healing processes took several months. Private Johnson returned to duty after 6 weeks and specifically requested to serve alongside Sarah whenever possible. Sergeant Martinez required extensive surgery, but survived thanks to the emergency treatment Sarah had provided in the field. Corporal Thompson's head injury was the most serious, but he eventually recovered completely with no lasting neurological damage. Word of Sarah's heroism reached the highest levels of military command, and she was recommended for several significant military honors. However, Sarah herself was uncomfortable with the attention her actions had generated. She had done what she believed was necessary to save lives, and she didn't consider her actions to be particularly heroic or unusual for a combat medic. The special operations teams in Iraq were particularly impressed by Sarah's actions. These elite soldiers understood better than anyone the level of courage required to cross an active kill zone under enemy fire. They began requesting Sarah's assignment to support their missions, knowing that having such a skilled and brave medic available could mean the difference between life and death during dangerous operations. Sarah found herself increasingly assigned to support special forces missions that required medical personnel willing to operate in high-risk environments. Her reputation for remaining calm under fire and providing excellent medical care made her invaluable to commanders planning dangerous operations. She participated in numerous missions over the following months, always maintaining her professional focus on saving lives. Despite her growing reputation, Sarah never sought recognition or special treatment. She continued to treat all soldiers equally, regardless of their rank or unit assignment. Her fellow medical personnel noted that she never talked about the ambush incident and seemed genuinely uncomfortable when others brought up her heroic actions. The psychological impact of the ambush affected Sarah in ways that she kept private. She had nightmares about the incident for months afterward, particularly dreams where she was unable to save the wounded soldiers. The sound of gunfire and helicopters sometimes triggered anxiety, responses that she learned to manage through meditation and physical exercise. Sarah completed her deployment in Iraq 6 months after the ambush incident, having saved dozens of additional lives through her medical expertise. She had been awarded the Silver Star for her actions during the convoy ambush, making her one of the few medical officers to receive such a high combat decoration. However, she rarely wore the medal and never discussed the circumstances that led to receiving it. When Sarah returned to the United States, she found that her reputation had preceded her. Military medical schools wanted her to speak about combat medicine, and other medical officers sought her advice about serving in dangerous environments. She politely declined most public speaking opportunities, preferring to focus on continuing her medical education and preparing for future deployments. The transition from combat deployment to peacetime military life was more difficult than Sarah had anticipated. She missed the intensity and purpose of combat medicine, where her skills directly determined whether soldiers lived or died. Routine medical duties felt mundane compared to the life and death decisions she had faced daily in Iraq. After taking several months to decompress and spend time with her family, Sarah volunteered for another combat deployment. Her superiors were initially reluctant to approve the request, suggesting that she had already done more than enough for her country. However, Sarah insisted that she belonged in the field where her skills were most needed. Her second deployment took her to Afghanistan, where she hoped to continue serving soldiers in combat situations while maintaining a lower profile than she had achieved in Iraq. She specifically requested assignment to a standard medical unit rather than special operations support, hoping to avoid the attention that her reputation might generate. However, Sarah quickly discovered that her reputation had followed her to Afghanistan. Soldiers throughout the theater had heard about the medic who had saved 3 lives during an ambush in Iraq, and many hoped to serve alongside the legendary figure. Sarah found it impossible to escape the expectations that others had developed about her capabilities and courage. The incident with the SEAL team was just the latest example of how her past actions continued to influence her current service. Sarah had hoped that the passage of time would allow her to serve quietly as a regular combat medic, but she was learning that some stories become larger than the people who live them. Standing outside the hospital after treating the wounded SEALs, Sarah realized that she would never be able to escape the reputation she had earned in Iraq. The story had become part of military culture, and every special operations soldier knew about the medic who had risked everything to save wounded comrades. Whether she liked it or not, she had become a symbol of medical courage that would follow her throughout her military career. The following weeks brought a series of encounters that made Sarah realize how deeply her story had penetrated military culture. Special operations teams throughout Afghanistan began specifically requesting her support for their missions. Word spread that the legendary medic from Iraq was now deployed in their theater, and commanders wanted her expertise available for their most dangerous operations. Sarah tried to maintain her low profile, but the requests kept coming through official channels. Her commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Hayes, called her into the office to discuss the unusual situation. The colonel explained that she had never seen such widespread interest in a single medical officer, and she wanted to understand why Sarah was so reluctant to accept the prestigious assignments being offered. During their conversation, Sarah finally opened up about the psychological burden of living up to others' expectations. She explained that the incident in Iraq had created a reputation that she felt pressured to maintain, but she worried about making decisions based on heroic expectations rather than sound medical judgment. The weight of being seen as some kind of superhuman medic was affecting her ability to serve effectively. Colonel Hayes listened carefully to Sarah's concerns and offered a perspective that surprised her. The colonel pointed out that Sarah's reputation was based on documented actions that had saved lives, not on exaggerated stories or propaganda. She suggested that perhaps Sarah was focusing too much on others' perceptions instead of trusting her own medical expertise and moral judgment. The conversation helped Sarah understand that she had been allowing her discomfort with fame to interfere with her primary mission of saving lives. She realized that avoiding challenging assignments because of reputation concerns was actually a disservice to the soldiers who needed her skills. Her expertise could make the difference between life and death for special operations teams engaged in the most dangerous missions. After much consideration, Sarah agreed to accept assignment to support a joint special operations task force conducting high-risk missions along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. The unit included SEALs, Army Rangers, and Delta Force operators who regularly engaged in combat situations where medical expertise could be crucial. Her role would be to provide immediate trauma care during and after combat operations. The task force commander, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, had specifically requested Sarah's assignment after reviewing her service record. He explained that his teams operated in remote areas where medical evacuation was often impossible, making the presence of a skilled combat medic essential for mission success. He had heard about her actions in Iraq and believed she was exactly what his unit needed. Sarah's first mission with the task force involved supporting a night raid on a suspected terrorist compound. The operation required her to remain in a forward position where she could quickly reach any wounded soldiers, but also exposed her to significant danger if the mission encountered heavy resistance. She prepared her medical equipment and reviewed casualty evacuation procedures with the helicopter crews. The raid went smoothly initially, with the special operations team securing the compound without significant resistance. However, as they were preparing to extract important intelligence materials, the unit came under attack from a larger enemy force that had been monitoring the area. The tactical situation quickly deteriorated into a fierce firefight that would test everyone's skills and courage. During the engagement, 2 Rangers were wounded by enemy grenades, and a SEAL team member took a rifle round to his chest. Sarah found herself once again treating wounded soldiers under fire, but this time she was working with the most elite military units in the American arsenal. These soldiers had heard the stories about her actions in Iraq, and they watched her work with a mixture of professional interest and personal admiration. Working with special operations teams was different from her previous experiences with regular military units. These soldiers were cross-trained in medical procedures and could provide more sophisticated assistance during emergency treatment. They also understood tactical medicine, concepts that allowed them to better coordinate medical care with ongoing combat operations. Sarah was impressed by the professionalism and competence of the special operations soldiers, but she also noticed the tremendous pressure they placed on themselves to perform perfectly in every situation. They had heard about her legendary status and seemed to expect her to perform medical miracles that exceeded normal human capabilities. She realized that they were projecting their own perfectionist standards onto her reputation. After successfully treating the wounded soldiers and completing the mission extraction, Sarah had a conversation with Sergeant Rodriguez that revealed the true source of the SEAL's reaction to her presence. He explained that special operations soldiers rarely encountered other military personnel who had demonstrated the same level of courage and competence under extreme pressure that defined their own units. The sergeant told Sarah that her story had become a benchmark for military courage that special operations soldiers used to measure their own actions. When they heard about a medic who had repeatedly crossed enemy fire to save wounded soldiers, they recognized someone who shared their own commitment to never leaving a comrade behind, regardless of personal risk. Sarah began to understand that her reputation was not just about medical skills or individual heroism. She had become a symbol of the military values that special operations soldiers held most sacred: courage, competence, and absolute commitment to saving fellow warriors. Her story resonated with them because it represented the same principles that guided their own actions in combat. This realization helped Sarah accept her role as both a skilled medical professional and an inspirational figure for other military personnel. She stopped trying to escape her reputation and instead focused on living up to the best aspects of the story while continuing to provide excellent medical care. She began to see her unique position as an opportunity to positively influence military culture and encourage other medical personnel to serve with courage and dedication. 6 months after joining the Special Operations Task Force, Sarah had participated in dozens of missions and saved numerous lives through her medical expertise. She had also become an integral part of the unit's culture, earning the respect and friendship of some of the military's most elite warriors. Her presence had improved not only their medical capabilities, but also their overall confidence during dangerous operations. The final mission of her deployment would prove to be the most challenging of her entire military career. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value terrorist target was meeting with other enemy leaders in a remote mountain compound. The mission required a complex, multi-team assault that would involve significant risk of casualties due to the difficult terrain and expected enemy resistance. Sarah prepared for the operation by studying the tactical plan and identifying the most likely locations where wounded soldiers might need treatment. The mountainous terrain would make medical evacuation extremely difficult, requiring her to be prepared for extended periods of providing trauma care under combat conditions. She organized her medical supplies for maximum efficiency and reviewed advanced surgical procedures she might need to perform in the field. The assault began before dawn with coordinated attacks from multiple directions designed to prevent the enemy leaders from escaping. Sarah positioned herself with the command element at a location that provided good visibility of the entire operation, while keeping her close enough to respond quickly to medical emergencies anywhere on the battlefield. The initial assault proceeded according to plan, with the Special Operations Team successfully breaching the compound defenses and securing the outer buildings. However, the enemy had prepared more extensive fortifications than intelligence reports had indicated, and they began mounting organized counterattacks designed to trap the American forces inside the compound. During the fierce fighting that followed, multiple soldiers were wounded by enemy fire and improvised explosive devices. Sarah found herself treating a steady stream of casualties while the battle raged around her position. The wounded included soldiers from different teams who required varying levels of medical care, from minor wounds to life-threatening injuries. The most challenging case involved a Delta Force operator who had taken multiple rifle rounds while clearing a heavily defended building. His injuries were severe and required immediate surgery that would normally be performed in a hospital operating room. However, medical evacuation was impossible due to the ongoing combat, and waiting would certainly result in his death. Working in a partially destroyed building with only battery-powered medical equipment, Sarah performed emergency surgery under conditions that would have been considered impossible in any medical training scenario. She was assisted by 2 other wounded soldiers who held lights and provided basic medical support despite their own injuries. The operation took over an hour, while bullets occasionally struck the walls around them. Throughout the extended firefight, Sarah treated 17 wounded soldiers with injuries ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to multiple gunshot trauma. She performed 3 emergency surgeries, set 2 broken bones, and managed several cases of severe blood loss. Her medical supplies were nearly exhausted by the time reinforcements arrived to help evacuate the wounded. All 17 soldiers survived their injuries and made full recoveries, including the Delta Force operator who had required emergency surgery in the field. Military medical experts later reviewed Sarah's treatment decisions and concluded that at least 6 of the soldiers would have died without her immediate intervention under combat conditions. The successful completion of her deployment marked the end of Sarah's combat service, as she had decided to transition to training other medical personnel rather than continuing with frontline deployments. She had served 2 combat tours and saved more than 50 lives through her medical expertise and courage under fire. Sarah's final military assignment took her to the Army Medical School, where she developed training programs for combat medics deploying to dangerous areas. She used her experiences to create realistic scenarios that prepared medical personnel for the psychological and technical challenges of treating wounded soldiers under enemy fire. Her training programs became the standard for combat medical education throughout the military, and hundreds of medics learned life-saving techniques based on procedures Sarah had developed during her combat deployments. She found deep satisfaction in knowing that her experiences were helping to save lives even after she was no longer serving in combat zones. The SEALs from her first day in Afghanistan had all completed their own deployments successfully, with several of them staying in contact with Sarah over the years. They credited her example with inspiring them to maintain the highest standards of courage and competence throughout their military careers. Her story continued to influence new generations of special operations soldiers who heard about the medic who never hesitated to risk her life for wounded comrades. Years later, Sarah reflected on her military service with pride tempered by humility. She had discovered that true heroism was not about seeking recognition or living up to others' expectations, but about consistently doing the right thing regardless of personal cost. Her story had become part of military tradition, but more importantly, her actions had saved lives and inspired others to serve with the same dedication. The silence Sarah had maintained about her actions in Iraq had eventually been broken by necessity, but she learned to accept her role as both a medical professional and a symbol of military values. She had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when motivated by love for their fellow warriors and commitment to their sworn duty to preserve life.